Hi, everybody. Or should I say, hi, all you cool cats and kittens. How you doing? I see a lot of people out there, and that makes me super excited. And I am sharing my screen. Hopefully, everyone can see everything okay. Uh, I am so glad you're here. I was very excited to find out that I got accepted for these 2 days, and I get to spend them with you all. And so let's get ourselves started. All right. I have the chat open. Feel free to ask questions at any point in time. I'll stop what I'm doing to answer your question. I know there's over 500 of us in here, and that's a lot of people. But I want to answer a question from every single person here, all 500 of you. So please ask a question. A little bit about me. My name's Kevin Griffin, if you haven't already figured that out. I'm a 10-time Microsoft MVP. My focus is in ASP.NET Core, Azure, and web development. I love working with all those different things. If at any time after this session you want to reach out to me, ask me a question, pick my brain, Twitter is probably the best place, and I give cookies to people that say nice things about me on Twitter. So @KevGriff on Twitter. Or you can email me. I'm kevin@consultwithgriff.com. And I also do a daily Twitch stream on twitch.tv @KevGriff. So I'm usually working on something at any point in time. So I welcome you to come hang out with me. Now, the question always comes up, where can I get the slides? Where can I get sample code? And a lot of the sample code we're going to write today, we're actually going to write on the fly. And I want to make that available to you and let you explore. But if you go to consultwithgriff.com/dapper, super easy. I'll have all the resources for this talk there. If you go there right now, there's a couple of resources, but I'll make sure the slides and code samples all get up there, no problem. Now, we don't have much time together. I could talk about this for hours, hours and hours, but we really need to start at the beginning. What is object mapping? And object mapping is pretty straightforward. If you've worked with databases, relational databases, you have probably made queries that say, all right, I need to select first name, last name, phone number, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, from a table, and you get back a list of results. And you have to take those results, and you can't really use them by themselves. You need to get them into some sort of data structure where it can be useful. Because let's be honest with ourselves, raw database results are pretty effing useless. If you've ever worked with a result set just out of the box, you spend a lot of time, you run into a lot of issues, and it's not useful by itself. What's useful is getting that data into an object that you can strongly type. You can check for null values or empty values, and you can add a little bit of constraint around the data that you're working with. There's a variety of ways to do this already, and you might be using one of these methods in your applications. I'm just going to kind of go down the list. The easiest, probably the fastest way to do object mapping is to read from a data reader yourself and putting it into an object. Now, that's not, it's fast. It's also cumbersome because you have to spend that tedious time going, all right, I need the element out of position 0. I need the element out of position 1, so on, so on. And it also doesn't work well if you change your column types or your column names, or if you change the position, the ordinal of the data coming back, you have to go back and you have to update all that code. So not the best approach. It is the fastest, but it's not the best. There's another way you can do it with data table, which I've used extensively in applications back in 2007 before there was a better way. But that was useful because you could take all your data, get it back in some sort of array format where you can access the columns directly by name and you can get the data out. The problem with data table is for large amounts of data, you get a lot of bloat and it takes up a ton of memory, and it's easier to use, just takes up a lot of resources, and it's inherently slow. Number 3 is Entity Framework. This is the Microsoft approved approach for doing object mapping. If you've ever taken the class on how do I do data access in Microsoft land, they're probably going to talk about Entity Framework. I'm just going to go on record now before there are any questions later. I'm not the biggest fan of Entity Framework. That's why I'm doing a talk on Dapper. Entity Framework does not solve problems for me. What it does is it creates more problems. And I will fully admit all those problems are because I'm an awful developer. And but I've learned from my downfalls, and I just don't use it in any of my applications. So if you ask me questions about how something compares to any framework, my answer will most likely be meh, I don't know. In Hibernate, if you just hate yourself, this works better with the live audience because there's so many people out there that just kind of shake their head and go, yeah, I enjoy pain. Then you have other micro-ORMs like Massive, Petapoco, and more. And these are great little frameworks that do one thing very well, and that's object mapping. The folks at Dapper actually do benchmarks against all these different processes for mapping result sets to objects. And I suggest you take a moment to go look at those benchmarks, because you'll find in cases Massive might be faster than Dapper in some cases. There's never a case where any framework is faster. So let's move on. I love Dapper. So Dapper is a simple object mapper, and it was generated or created by the good folks at Stack Overflow. Now, I am fairly sure that all 528 people on this call right now have heard of Stack Overflow. Most of your code bases are 80% code copied and pasted from Stack Overflow. I mean, without Stack Overflow, most of us cannot call ourselves developers. So I take it with I put a lot of respect into a tool set created by the folks at Stack Overflow, because they deal with issues and constraints that I will never have in my applications, because they're one of the top 5 most hit sites on the internet. There's a statistic out somewhere, don't quote me. So they need to be crazy fast. They have to work with a massive amount of data, and they have to do this across millions and millions of requests per second. And if you've never read their engineering blogs, Nick Craver, he writes some gold if you're interested in .NET performance. So I love Dapper because Dapper was designed to do one thing. It was designed to map result sets into objects and do that crazy fast, but make it simple and easy to use. So a couple of things about Dapper. It's a micro-ORM. And I use micro in quotes because it's doing this one simple thing. It's moving data from a result set into an object, because we can use objects. Result sets, we have to do a little bit more work. A couple things it's not going to do. It's not going to do SQL generation on your behalf. You're better than that. You can build your own databases. You might have people on your team that can build databases. You know how to design a table. You know how to set up keys. Heck, if you're really good, you might know how to create an index that actually works and doesn't degrade the performance of your application. But you know how to write SQL. You know how to do select something from a table. Or take that a step further. You might know how to do a join across 2 or multiple tables. You might know how to filter queries by using a where clause. We could go over SQL basics, but once you've learned a couple key commands in SQL, you know 95% of what you need to know to write most line of business applications. There's no database generation, so it's not like we're designing our code first and then our code is going to go generate our database on our behalf. I've never liked that approach because I think it doesn't play to the strengths of the database that we're using. When I design SQL databases, I design it for the strengths of SQL. I think about how am I going to use this data and what actions, what queries am I going to perform against it, and I design the database in that way. I don't want to write the code and let the code play a guessing game of how the database should get created. Again, another reason why I don't use any framework. And it's how a couple other ORMs out there work as well. This is why I like the micro aspect of Dapper. I'm not worried about the database. The database and my code are 2 separate things that need to interact with each other. And I want to make that interaction as simple as possible. But most importantly, it creates a fluid map between our data readers and objects. I just want to say, here's a query, give me back an object, or give me back a set of objects. And that's what Dapper does really well. Now, I'm going to say SQL Server a lot because 99% of the work I do with Dapper is across SQL Server. But any relational database that you're using most likely works with Dapper. So if you're using SQLite, if you're using Oracle, Postgres, all those work just fine with Dapper because Dapper isn't tied to a specific implementation of a database. And again, if Stack Overflow can use it, it's probably good for me as well. Installing is really straightforward. It's just a NuGet package. Go in the NuGet, type in Dapper, and there are versions of Dapper for any framework that you might be targeting. So if you're targeting .NET Standard with .NET Core, there's a version of Dapper. If you're still on .NET Full Framework, older version, there are versions of Dapper that work with the full framework, no problem. You're also going to see some things like Dapper Contrib. And I'm not going to talk about Dapper Contrib in this talk, but there's even more helper methods in Dapper Contrib that make this work so much easier to do. It's worth a talk all on its own. So what I like to do is I like to talk through some scenarios, and I actually have a whole bunch of slides that go over these common scenarios of using Dapper, but that's not really any fun. I'm comfortable with my database that I have up right now. So I'm going to just jump into some code. We're going to write some code on the fly, walking through a couple examples. And I might jump back into slides in a little bit just to make sure I check all the boxes. So with that, let's jump over into Visual Studio. And I love to start these demos with nothing. So the key things I have already done, just so you're aware, I have already created my database, and that database is AdventureWorks 2017. I spent literally 2 minutes finding it. I was going to try to use a better test database, but AdventureWorks gets the job done. It has a bunch of data in it, and we want to query against that data. I've set up my connection string, so just talking to my local database, AdventureWorks. And I've installed 2 packages that are important. Oh, no, I haven't. So I installed SQL Client, but then I need to go install Dapper. So we'll type in Dapper. It's always the one at the top. We'll click install. And OK. Wait a moment. Shouldn't take any time to install at all. All right. Close NuGet. And we'll come back into our Dapper controller. Though there's a couple things that we need to set up first before we can make the database connection. That is, we need to pick a table to talk to. Let me zoom in here, and I'm just going to choose person dot. Let's do person dot person. What's in this database? All right, there's a couple things in here. So we have first name, we have last name, middle initial, and yeah, you know what, this is a good starting point. So let's take this request and let's get it down to just the bare essentials. So some have a title, some have just a null. So we'll get this down to a very basic. And let's see what we got here. All right, yep, we're good. First name, middle initial, and last name. I want to take this query, I want to build a model around it, and I want to set it up so when I call this query, it comes back as an object. Let's actually copy the query and go back out to Visual Studio. I'm going to set it up outside of my connection. And now let's go create a model. I'll add a new class. Now there's a couple of things I'm doing wrong in this project, and you don't need to ask me questions about it. I'm putting data access layer inside of my web app. That's a no-no, don't do that. Don't be like Kevin. We'll call this person. The way you should really do this is you should have another assembly that has your business logic in it, and that has all your interfaces, and then you have your implementations in another assembly. Then you set up dependency injection, so you're injecting a service interface, and you're pulling that in. You have to do all that work, but we don't have time for that. Let's see what we want. We want title, first name, last name, middle initial. Well, let's set this up like we would any object. So we'll say string title, first name, middle initial. So what was it? Middle name. Who wants middle name? You want middle initial. And then lastly, we want last name. Okay, so very simple object. And title can be null, but strings are nullable types. So my string could come back null. It's not a problem. We'll go into our Dapper controller, and Dapper works off of the connection, a SQL connection. In fact, most of Dapper are just extension methods off of SQL connection. So I could just say, well, I need persons to, we'll say connection.query. Now, let me take a look at some of these over. So they're all extension methods: query, query async, query first, QueryFirstOrDefault, query multiple, query single. We'll talk about these. They're not all that complex. So we'll say query async, and I need to pass in the SQL that I want to send. Oh, sorry, this is a generic, so I need to pass in the type that I want to map it to. So I'm going to pass in SQL, just SQL by itself. That's all. And this will return an enumerable of persons. And then I can just say return OK persons. Well, this is pretty cool. Notice a couple things I didn't have to do. I didn't have to do connection.open. If you've ever written database code, that is always the step I forget, to open the database connection. It's always, oh, let's just start using the database. Oh, you forgot to open the database, Kevin. Yeah, we're going to have to reject this query. All right, Dapper takes care of that for you. It also takes care of cleaning up or closing the connection later. And because I'm in the using statement, I can reuse this connection as many times as I want to. And when it's all done, it's going to close and dispose on its own. Now, if this all works accordingly, I can hit F5. Let's go in debug mode. Oh, error. What did I do wrong? Someone's yelling at their screen. Kevin, you forgot a semicolon. All right, so I got a browser popping up. Let me go to that endpoint, which is API/Dapper. I hit my breakpoint and execute the query, and we'll see what it returns. 19,000 rows, just all bound automatically. Now, if I return that, it's going to come back as JSON. There's a whole bunch of JSON in there. Yeah, so it's all it's all there. And also, you see we're getting nulls where we have titles that are null. We have some titles that are filled in. Dapper is taking care of that nullables versions for us anyway. So cool. That's good to go. Now I know what your next question might be. You say, well, Kevin, how do I deal with where clauses? It's not like I'm just going to return data for the sake of data. So let's do a where clause. So I want persons where. So we'll say where, let me stop debugging so I get rid of the squigglies, where first name is equal to some values. So we'll just pass in a first name. Well, let's find a first name that we actually know exists in here. Hey, there's a Kevin. How many Kevins do we have? Lots and lots of Kevins. Okay, so we should get back about 60 Kevins. It's not enough Kevins in my opinion. Well, if you look at my SQL, I'm passing in the parameter. So Dapper will also take care of parameterizing queries on your behalf. And so if I pass @ with the name of the parameter, what Dapper will do is it will look for an object property that has that's called first name. And if it finds that, it's going to pass in as a parameter to Dapper. So we'll go into our query async, and the next parameter is going to be parameters. And we'll pass a new, just a, what is it called, anonymous object. And my anonymous object is going to have a property called first name. We'll pass in Kevin. Now I'm creating an anonymous object, but if you have an actual object, you can pass in whatever you want to here. All Dapper is going to do is look to see if there are properties on it that match properties in your SQL query. So let's rerun this again. So now we'll run our SQL query with our parameter. This returns 60 persons. And if we take a look, it's all the Kevins. I hope my zoom is coming through because I'm trying to zoom in on this data to make it easier for you all to see. But see a whole bunch of Kevins and other data. Well, that's useful. This is starting to get down and dirty. So let's see. I talked about query async with parameters, and see query async with dynamic parameters. This is an issue I've ran into at least 3 or 4 times with different aspects, and that's I have some queries that get built dynamically. So let's see. Let me see if I can fix this. Let's say from query, we'll add a parameter called bool get Kevins. All right. Now remember, this is demo code. This is not necessarily what I would do in a real production application, but I don't have the time to build a real production application. So we're going to do a test here that says, well, if get Kevins is true, I want to take the SQL query and I'm going to add the line to it where first name is equal to first name. Okay. Let's see. Let me make sure that all should still work fine. Actually, let me add the space in there just in case. And I know you're saying, Kevin, you should use a string builder. That's probably better. Yeah, I know. Now, I don't want this query. I don't want to pass in the query parameters every single time, no matter what. So instead, I'm going to add some dynamic parameters. And the actual use case where I use this is we have a search feature, and a search feature has like 10 different options. They're all optional. You don't have to put anything in for any of them. But if you put it in for one of them, maybe you were searching for a date or you're searching for a name. Well, what we do is we dynamically build a SQL query off of that. And if you say, well, I need to search off first name, we'll add a where clause for first name, and then we create dynamic parameters where in the dynamic parameters, we say, all right, well, if I'm asking for first name, I'm going to add a parameter called first name. I'm going to give it a value of Kevin. And then in our actual query, we'll pass in dynamic parameters. So if I move my breakpoint around, try this one more time. We'll do API/Dapper. So I'll do it now without any parameters. So get Kevin's is false. We can still pass in dynamic parameters even though it's empty, and this is going to return all the people. But now this should work. If I say $, was it get Kevin's? Make that equal to true. Get Kevin's is true. We'll add our where clause, so the SQL is now updated. Again, that would look better with a SQL with a string builder. We'll add our dynamic parameter, and we'll pass that into our function that only returns Kevin's. So yay, nothing but Kevin's. All right. The couple other methods that you can call on here that might make things useful for you, and I'm not even going to code these directly. We'll look at the slides for these. The first one is going to be QueryFirst or QueryFirstOrDefault. Those are useful if you're only returning one row or you know you're returning one row. What's really nice, so if you're building a query and you just need to know if something exists in the database, you might just write a query that says, well, give me the top one with a column field. Well, if you get one row back, you know that that row exists. Or if you're looking someone up in a users table and you're just getting their user information. Well, you don't want to return all the users and then filter it on the server. You just want to get the first one with the query. So you might write a top one query, or you might forget to put the top one and just say, well, select the user data where the user ID is equal to 10. And if you do a traditional query clause, it's going to go return that set. If you forget to do the aware clause and you're just returning all the data and you just need to know if there's one thing in there, you can say, well, query first or query first or default. There's also query single or default. And my recommendation there is just be a little bit careful when you use those, because if you are returning multiple rows and you're just taking the first one, it will still iterate through the entire result set before returning, even though you're returning one row. I don't use this one very often. All right, I think that's enough for reads. Let's talk about inserts, updates, and deletes. And these are not really all that more complicated. I'm just going to use the slides here for demonstration, because writing this code out by hand can take a bit of time. But essentially, you have an object. You probably have an object in memory. You got it from an API post or another part of your data. And you need to insert that data into your application. Well, if you know SQL, you know how to write an insert statement. And inserts are nice because you're only ever inserting into one table. And so you write an insert statement. Insert into table the fields you want to insert into, and then the values to inject into the statement. Now, again, you want to do this as a parameterized query because you want to restrict yourself from SQL injection. And Dapper's got you covered. So you take your SQL, you take your object, and you just call it execute or execute async and tell it, here's the insert that I want to run, and here's the object that I want to pass into it. And it will return the number of rows that get inserted. So in this case, 1. And you could do a quick check to say, did the execute actually happen? Even better, if you do something that would throw a SQL exception, Dapper doesn't capture exceptions. Those go up the call stack. So your execute async would still fire a SQL exception if something were to happen. Here's an update instead of an insert. So same thing. When you're updating a very specific table. So say I want to update table massive user list. I want to set a property equal to a new value that I'm going to pass in where a condition exists. Well, I have 2 parameters. I have the set parameter for my update, and I have the parameter for my where clause. Well, those get passed into the same object, the same parameter object. So I say execute async. Use query when you're looking up data. Use execute when you're executing non-queries. So date of birth, and pick a random date, and then first name Jim. Those get parameterized and sent to SQL Server. SQL turns on and sends back the result. Again, this is going to be a number depending on how many rows get updated. So if this update clause were to update 50 rows, the result coming back would be 50. And then deletes, I want to make sure I cover all the CRUD aspects of Dapper, because this is what I do 99% of the time with our data access layer. Deletes are simple. Delete from a table, pass in a where clause. Always pass in a where clause. Don't make that mistake, more than 15 times. Pass in a where clause, execute async, pass in the parameters in the SQL, and everything magically works. And it will return the result if the delete were to occur. Now I'm writing a whole bunch of code where I'm just pasting the SQL, and it's like a magic string almost. Now in our applications, we do a couple different things, because I know you might be out there going, Kevin, why are you just putting SQL into strings and you're passing that string? Isn't that hard to manage? And the short answer is no. It was harder to manage our entity framework just guessing what our queries were going to be. We put most of our queries into string constants, and more complex queries get turned into stored procedures. Because remember, I want to take advantage of what the database is good at. And if I'm doing complex lookups or inserts or updates, I don't want to write that code in my C#. I don't want to have to pass that all in through Dapper. It's better, easier, faster, quicker, whatever, to just write a stored procedure, because that's where the logic's going to exist anyway. So I'll write a stored procedure to do a lot of massive work. Well, how do you call a stored procedure with Dapper? Can you call a stored procedure with Dapper? The answer is yes. So if you have a stored procedure, in this example, I'm passing in SQL called last name list. Well, this points to a stored procedure on my database where we return a list of last names. Maybe it's filtered. Maybe there's some magic happening back there. But I'm just passing in the name of the stored procedure I want to execute. And the only special thing I have to do with Dapper is tell it, still, I want to do a query async. I want to pass in the data. And I need to tell it that the command that I'm running is a stored procedure. That way, Dapper knows that it's not going to execute a traditional query. It's going to execute a stored procedure. And then the results come back the same way as they did before. If I was executing a stored procedure that was doing updates and inserts and all that good stuff, I don't have to call query. I could just call execute, like we said before. Any non-query, use execute. And it would go off, run the stored procedure, and send back the results. We could go even farther down the rabbit hole and talk about, well, what if you have a stored procedure that does updates and inserts, but it still returns data after the fact? Well, you can do that with Dapper. It's just more lines of code than I have on this demo slide. If you have output parameters, you can do all that with Dapper as well. It's really easy to set up. The last thing one of the last things to talk about is transactions, because this is where Dapper, you have to start doing some stuff a little bit differently than you did before. And I'm going to do this one in code because, why not? We got plenty of time. Let's see, while I'm doing this, are there any questions I need to answer in person, or are we good?
So far so good. Let's maybe keep them until the end.
Okay, yeah, that works for me. Yep. All right, well, let's delete some of this code. And let's set up a simple insert into persons where, let's see, is it going to let me do this easily? I think so. We'll try it. We'll just see what happens. Let's take our, no. All right, for our sake, we're just going to create a very simple table. We'll call it ID. It'll be a big int, and we'll say foobar, and that's a invarchar 50. And we'll do the basic stuff, like we'll set the primary key, and we'll set the identity. So it'll do something. We'll call this Kevin's test table. All right. So now let's go into our app and let's generate some inserts. So we'll grab our insert statement. That took much longer to do than I could have just typed it out by hand. All right, we'll come in here, we'll replace our SQL. And I'm going to change the parameter. We'll call this foobar. And I'm going to execute async some SQL, and we'll pass in, I don't actually have to pass anything into this. And we'll pass in a new object. We'll call it foobar is equal to and then datetime UTC now, we'll do ticks. All right, because it doesn't really have to be unique. So we just need some sample code that puts a whole bunch of stuff in the database. I don't need persons anymore. And we're going to do for var x equals 0, while x is less than 10,000. All right, so this is just a very simple piece of test code that inserts a whole bunch of stuff into the database. Set a breakpoint, just make sure it works. We'll do API Dapper. All right, so that works. That means all of them should work. And we let it spin for a moment. And now let's just see what's inside the Kevin's test table. There's a whole bunch of stuff. So zoom in. Whole bunch of test data. Okay, well, that's great. Let's go ahead and clean that up. So truncate table, Kevin's test table. Let's get rid of all that data. All right, well, let's set this up with a transaction. So there's no special sauce in Dapper by itself for transactions. What you're going to do is you're going to set up a transaction very similar to as you would with regular SQL client. So we'll say connection begin transaction. And actually, hold on. One thing you do have to do differently here. You do have to open your connection manually when using transactions. So we'll open async. We'll begin our transaction. But then here on our execute, I can pass in another parameter, which is called transaction. And so we'll pass in the transaction we just opened. When all is said and done, we will do transaction.commit. And that should magically work. All right, we'll open up API/Dapper. Let's run through this again. Make sure I didn't miss anything. Yep. All right, so we have a transaction going. Now I'm doing the full transaction and it's going to get everything in there. Let's take out the truncate real fast. All right, so all my test results are in there. Well, then what happens if something fails? Well, if x is equal to, I'm not in JavaScript, we'll just say 5,000, we'll throw a new exception. Which will actually kick off a rollback because we're never getting to the commit. All right, so let's do this again and should throw my exception here in a moment. All right, so I got out. Oh, I forgot to truncate my table. Hold on, let me restart that sample. All right, nothing. Let's restart. It's adding a bunch of stuff. There's the exception. Ouch. Go back in. So there's still nothing in there because the transaction never happened. So I highly recommend this. The only reason I add this to the talk is because I've gotten this question every time I've talked about Dapper is how to use it with transactions. And this is how. You have to use more of the SQL client platform than you do Dapper doing this work for you on your behalf. All right, and let's see. All right, and there's loads I could talk about, but I'm getting to the point where I am ready to take some Q&A. So now's the perfect time for Q&A.
All right, sounds good. Let me share my webcam as well and then go over a couple of questions that I think are really, really relevant to a lot of people.
Yeah.
One would be, would Dapper actually work with non-relational databases like Cosmos DB or anything else there?
That is a great question. I believe it has to be relational, but I have been wrong before. And let me just do a quick double check. It's not like we can't just go to GitHub. Because they have a list of their supports on here somewhere. Works with ADO providers. So does Cosmos have an ADO provider? I don't recall off the top of my head. So I think that's the requirement. If it has an ADO provider, which most relational databases do, you can use it with Dapper. Because then like Mongo, not like document-based databases, I don't think they have ADO wrappers with them. So that's really the answer to the question. If it has an ADO provider, you can use it. If it doesn't, you're out of luck.
All right, cool. Then another one is around testing. Is there a way to write unit tests for classes using Dapper and for all the queries that you're writing there, or how would you tackle that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I am not as proficient at testing as I probably should be, but all of Dapper is unit tested before it goes out live. And you can definitely use Dapper around like a mocking framework. So if you want to mock some of your data, you could even build mock data sources and use Dapper against it. I've never done that. I've seen a couple examples in the past. So it is designed to fit into your workflow. Even though I don't personally do a lot of that stuff, I do know there are examples out there of people doing that.
All right. Yeah, then there's a couple of questions around code generation and all of that. So let's maybe group them sort of together.
Okay.
One part would be, is there a concept of database migrations in Dapper?
Nope. So the one thing you're doing in Dapper is you're writing code against the database as it currently exists. So if you're doing things like if you need to worry about migration, so we're going from one version of the database to another version of the database, you are probably using another tool to worry about that part. And from a code aspect, you're tying your code, your SQL, to a version of the database. So if your database is changing, you have to go back and change your code. Usually, what we're doing there is we put all of our select statements, our inserts, updates, and stuff into string constants. So when I update a table, I can quickly look for aspects of where I'm using that table, and I generally don't have to worry too much about migrations. I'm also only ever at one time managing one version of the app. So if you're in a scenario where you need to worry about or support multiple versions of an app at any point in time, you might need a different workflow. But I do know for all of our cases that we have with my team, we're only ever working on one version of the app. So the person who is changing the database is also the person who's changing the code. And we use tools like Redgate, SQL source control. So we bind all that together. So a commit is the state of the database schema along with the code to access that database.
All right, and do you always write that code manually, or are there also ways to, for example, take a database table and then scaffold some POCOs from that?
So there are there's a couple different tools that you can use to take a database table and create a POCO out of it. I don't have any off the top of my head, but I've used a couple. Then I need to go find them. I'll add them to my resources page because that's a great question, especially if you have a 50-column table. Writing all that out by hand is cumbersome or tedious. So there are tools out there that will generate those for you.
All right, makes sense. And then one more on code generation. Well, code generation, probably a little bit of boilerplate codes.
Yep.
How would you handle the typical boilerplate CRUD SQL statements? Like you have a class and you want to insert that one into the database or query it. How do you go about that?
Yeah, you could definitely abstract a lot of that out. So create some sort of base class that knows, well, here is a select statement follows a general pattern, and you can generate the SQL commands on the fly. Because remember, our SQL commands are just strings that we're passing into Dapper, and Dapper's doing the hard work of turning those into command text and sending it off to the database provider. I would build a simple base class and say, okay, well, here's the object I'm mapping to. We could reflect over that and get the actual columns. This is one thing I didn't really talk too much about is the property names of my objects match one for one the fields in my database. If you go away from that and you have different column names in your database and you do fields in your objects, you have to do a little bit of tuning to get Dapper to do that mapping on your behalf. Your life is usually much easier if you change the SQL results to map your objects. Then the simplest way to do that is just do an alias on a select statement. So instead of, if your object's property is first name, but the SQL database column is first, well, just alias it the first name when it comes back. Because doing the custom mapping with Dapper you're almost better off just doing it the hard way. But that's also a similar problem. There's also attributes you could add to it. It's been a while since I've done that. Our best practice is our property names match our column names in the database.
All right. A couple more maybe. One is around stored procedures. Do you actually prefer using stored procedures over having all of the queries directly in your project, or what do you prefer or recommend for people to use?
For multi-step processes, I will generally go to the stored procedure just because those are easier to read, maintain, and test in a stored procedure versus me just having a big string that in my code that does that. But for single line queries or executions, I will usually just put those into as a string constant. And it's always as a string constant because we try to reuse as much as possible. And we also don't want, sometimes you use the same query in multiple ways. So we'll write the string constant once and we'll use it in multiple places. Well, if someone changes the string constant, it's only changed in one place and it reflects throughout the entire application. Whereas I've been on some projects where the person has literally taken the query and copy and pasted it 10 times and made slight adjustments to each one. Well, if you change the table, now you have to change it in 10 different places instead of just one place. Just things you learn the hard way.
All right, makes sense. Yep. Let's maybe do two more, just to make sure that we don't exhaust you with questions, because there's many of them, and we'll forward them on to you. One is about things to explore beyond just Dapper. Are there any good extension libraries on NuGet, for example, that people should explore or are worth exploring on top of just plain generic Dapper?
Well, there's a plain generic Dapper. There's also Dapper Contrib. Dapper Contrib really tries to build a fluent interface on top of Dapper, which is a fluent interface on top of a SQL connection. I would definitely look at Dapper contrib and spend some time there just to see what's available to you. On top of that, it's other than just Dapper, I'm not sure what else to recommend. There's nothing else that stands out in my workflow that stands out. And I will say again, Dapper is something I always install by default whenever I'm starting a new project or a new demo, because it's just something I always go to use, and then I realize I don't have it. So it's a part of every template of a new application we build if we're going to talk to a database or SQL database.
All right. Yeah, and then as a last question, you showed how to use parameters in your queries and in the stuff that you're executing against the database.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any general additional recommendation against avoiding SQL injections using Dapper?
The big thing is make sure you're parameterizing queries. The Dapper makes it hard for you to not parameterize your queries. And so other than that, I don't think I have any other recommendations that stand out to me. Because if you're parameterizing queries, you're not going to accidentally inject SQL injection into your parameters. Dapper will protect you from that. Using dynamic parameters, if you're not sure which parameters you're going to pass in, that helps tremendously as well, because like I used my search example before, as you're building a large, robust query, you might not know what you're going to pass in, and it is really easy to just accidentally do a plus a variable in a string, and you've done SQL injection and didn't mean to. We just use code reviews for making sure that, hey, you changed the SQL statement, you accidentally injected you injected something, and you could have SQL injection. Making sure you test. So even if you're using parameters, make sure you're encoding strings and stuff properly, so you're not passing in bad data. And so always check your inputs. And you don't worry about the outputs because it's coming out of database. But yeah.
Cool. Then there's a couple more. We'll try to answer them as we go. But sorry if your question was not handled, but do reach out to Kevin. Kevin, yeah. I think you have your contact details still on maybe an ending slide, no?
Say that again? Oh, yep.
Yeah.
There you go.
All right, there we go.
Let me go back to this other one. That's a better slide. I updated the slide deck and forgot to update that one. Here we go.
All right, perfect.
Yep.
So I guess people can reach out if they have any more questions.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, throw them at me, because you might give me a scenario I never considered, and I would love to research it more.
Cool. Thank you very much for a very fascinating talk, actually. I have to explore this thing as well. And yeah, we'll see you next time.